Bear and her 3 cubs knock on man's door in desperation. What he discovers will bring you to tears. It was an unusually cold morning in the forest, with a crisp chill in the air that made the trees shake. A light snow had covered the ground, and the stillness of the wilderness made everything feel more isolated. The usual sounds of birds and animals were silenced, as if nature itself was holding its breath. But something wasn't right. Deep within this quiet forest, a mother bear was struggling. Her thick fur, usually vibrant and strong, was matted with snow, and her movements were slow and heavy. She had been walking for hours, her tired feet dragging along the snow, her breath coming out in visible puffs. Behind her were her 3 cubs, but they were struggling just as much. One cub was limping, its little paws weak and sore from the cold, making it hard for it to keep up. Another cub was trembling with fear, its big eyes wide and filled with anxiety. The 3rd cub, barely able to walk from exhaustion, clung to its mother for warmth and comfort. They had nowhere to go, no place to find shelter from the bitter cold that seemed to pierce their very bones. The forest that had once been their safe home was no longer. Whether it had been a fire or human activity, the bear and her cubs had lost everything. Their den was gone, and they had nowhere to hide from the snowstorm that was sweeping through the area. The air was freezing, and with each passing minute, the bear's desperation grew. The mother bear, sensing her family's dire need for shelter, looked around helplessly. She knew they couldn't survive out here much longer. She spotted a house far in the distance, the thin plume of smoke from the chimney rising up into the frosty sky. It was a small house, but it was their only chance. With her remaining strength, the bear pushed forward, her cubs following closely behind. Her paws were heavy, and each step seemed harder than the last. The snow was deep, and the cold seeped into her bones, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The lives of her cubs depended on her. When the bear reached the house, she stopped for a moment. She looked up at the door, the only barrier between her and the warmth her cubs so desperately needed. With no other option, the mother bear lifted one massive paw and gently, almost timidly, knocked on the door. It wasn't a loud, aggressive knock, but a soft, almost pleading tap. It was a sound filled with emotion, a call for help from a mother who knew that her time was running out. Her cubs huddled behind her, their small bodies trembling from the cold. They didn't understand why they were standing there, but they could sense their mother's fear and anxiety. The knock was a signal of their desperation. The mother bear's knock wasn't just a plea for shelter. It was a cry for help, a message to anyone inside that they were in grave danger. The cold was unforgiving, and the bear knew that her cubs couldn't survive much longer in the freezing conditions. They needed warmth, safety, and care. She hoped that someone inside the house could offer them that, but there was no way to know for sure. Inside the house, Thomas, a man living alone, was going about his usual morning routine. He had just made a fresh cup of coffee and was sitting by the window, looking out at the snowy landscape. The world outside was peaceful, yet there was a strange feeling in the air, as if something was about to change. Suddenly, Thomas heard a soft knock on the door. At first, he didn't think much of it. Could be a neighbor, a delivery person, or anyone else. But then the knock came again, louder and more urgent. It was almost as if the person or thing on the other side of the door needed immediate help. Thomas, confused and a bit uneasy, stood up and walked toward the door. Something about the knock didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual knock he was used to. Felt almost desperate. He reached for the doorknob, his heart beating a little faster with each step. The suspense grew. What could be waiting for him on the other side of that door? A lost traveler? A stray animal? Or something else entirely? Should Thomas open the door? What could be out there knocking on his door? Would it be safe? Or was he about to face something he wasn't prepared for? The tension hung in the air as Thomas slowly turned the knob, wondering what would happen next. The unknown awaited him on the other side of that door, and whatever it was desperate. Thomas had always been a man who preferred his solitude. Living in the quiet outskirts of a small town, he found comfort in the peacefulness of his home, surrounded by the vast, untouched wilderness. His days were simple, consisting of routine tasks. A cup of coffee in the morning, tending to his small garden, and walking through the woods when the weather allowed it. He had never expected his life to be disrupted by anything out of the ordinary. But on this particular morning, everything was about to change. Thomas was in his late 30s, with a rugged, weathered look from years of working with his hands and living in isolation. His face bore the marks of solitude, soft wrinkles around his eyes, and a calm demeanor that came from being alone for so long. He had never married, preferring the company of books and the occasional visit from neighbors. Life had been predictable, comfortable even, and he was content with it. That is, until the knock on his door shattered that comfort. When Thomas first heard the knock, his immediate reaction was confusion. It wasn't the kind of knock he was used to. It wasn't a knock that sounded like it belonged to a human, too soft, too hesitant. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a traveler in need of help? A lost hunter? Or perhaps an animal? It wasn't unusual to see wildlife near his home, but a bear? That seemed highly unlikely. As he stood in front of the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob, fear began to creep in. What could be on the other side of that door? His mind quickly flashed to the possibility of danger. He had read stories of wild animals being bold in their search for food, especially in the harsh winter months. What if it was a bear looking for shelter? Or worse, what if the bear was aggressive, bringing its cubs with it in a protective territorial state? Thomas was no stranger to fear, but this was different. This wasn't the kind of fear that came from facing something he could physically fight off or understand. This was the fear of the unknown, the fear of facing something that could potentially change everything in an instant. He stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of the situation. The snow outside continued to fall, the cold pressing against the walls of his house, but his thoughts were colder. Should he open the door? What if he was wrong? What if it wasn't a bear, but something else? A danger he couldn't predict or control. His mind raced through scenarios. He could ignore the knock and stay safe inside, but that didn't sit right with him. His curiosity was piqued, but so was his fear. What if opening the door was a mistake? What if the moment he opened it, something dangerous would rush in? Or worse, what if he found something heartbreaking? But then there was another part of him, the part that believed in doing what was right, the part that couldn't ignore a cry for help, no matter where it came from. Could this be a mother bear in desperate need of help for her cubs? Could his refusal to open the door mean turning his back on a family in need? Thomas's internal battle was fierce. Do I open the door and face whatever's on the other side? Or do I stay inside where it's safe and ignore the possible suffering that's out there? He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts colliding in every direction. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Finally, he made a choice. With a deep breath, he reached out, slowly turned the knob, and prepared himself to face whatever lay beyond. As Thomas's hand gripped the doorknob, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. He stood there, frozen for a moment, weighing his options. The warmth inside his house felt so comforting, and the cold outside was biting. The knock had been soft, but the urgency in it, something primal and raw, struck a chord deep within him. His heart raced, and his thoughts became a blur, torn between caution and compassion. What if the bear was just looking for shelter? What if the mother bear and her cubs were freezing out there? How could he just ignore that? The thought of leaving them to suffer in the cold gnawed at him. For a brief moment, Thomas considered closing the door and pretending he hadn't heard the knock. But something in him couldn't do it. What if this was a cry for help? What if this was a chance to make a difference in the lives of creatures who needed him? Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. He would open the door. The moment he turned the knob, the door creaked open slowly, revealing the icy, snow-covered landscape. The cold air rushed into the house, causing him to shiver. But standing on the other side was not what he had expected. It wasn't a person, nor was it an ordinary visitor. It was something much more extraordinary. At first, Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. Standing there in the snow was a mother bear, but she wasn't standing proudly as he'd imagined. She was hunched over, Her body slumped with exhaustion. Her fur was matted with snow and dirt, and her large brown eyes were filled with a kind of sorrow and fear he had never seen before. Behind her, 3 tiny cubs huddled together, their fur covered in snow, their tiny bodies trembling from the cold. The cubs were so small, barely old enough to be away from their mother, yet here they were, struggling to stay on their feet. Thomas's heart tightened as he realized just how dire the situation was. The bear's eyes met his for a brief moment, and in that instant, Thomas felt a connection. A silent plea for help that seemed to come directly from the bear's soul. It wasn't an animal looking for food or a fight. This was a mother, desperate to protect her cubs from the harsh cold and the dangers of the world. Thomas hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't leave them outside in the cold, but he also didn't know how to help a wild bear and her cubs. His mind raced with questions. Should I let them in? What if they're too dangerous? What if they hurt the cubs, or worse, what if they attack me? But as he looked into the bear's eyes again, he saw nothing but fear and vulnerability. She wasn't asking for a fight. She was asking for help. With a sudden, almost heartbreaking grunt, the mother bear took a step forward, her body visibly shaking. She pushed her cubs gently toward the door with her nose, as if urging them to go inside. Thomas noticed one of the cubs limping, its tiny leg dragging behind it, unable to walk properly. The other 2 cubs were shivering uncontrollably, their small bodies covered in frost. As the bear moved closer to him, Thomas realized the full extent of their struggle. This wasn't just a bear looking for shelter. It was a desperate mother trying to save her family. She had been forced out of her den by something. Maybe a fire, or maybe the severe cold had driven her away. The look on her face said it all. She was exhausted, broken, and afraid for her cubs. Thomas felt his heart break. He could see the physical strain in her movements, the way she could barely lift her paws, the way her cubs relied on her, each of them weak from hunger and cold. There was no denying it now. This family needed him, and there was no turning back. The emotional weight of the moment hit Thomas like a wave. The helplessness of the bear, her desperate need for help, and the tiny, fragile cubs made his decision clear. There was no more doubt, no more fear. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. With a soft, reassuring voice, he spoke gently, as if trying to ease the bear's anxiety. "Come in," he whispered. "You're safe now." The bear, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion, stepped forward with slow, careful movements, guiding her cubs inside the warmth of the house. Once the mother bear and her cubs were inside, Thomas closed the door behind them, his hands trembling slightly. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the freezing temperatures outside, but it also made the reality of the situation feel even more urgent. He could hear the soft whimpering of the cubs as they tried to settle near the warmth of the fireplace. The mother bear, though still standing, seemed to relax a little, her body sagging with relief. But despite the sense of relief, Thomas knew that simply bringing them inside wasn't enough. They needed help, real help. The cubs were in bad shape, and the mother was clearly struggling. Thomas couldn't stand the thought of letting them suffer any longer. He couldn't just ignore the gravity of their situation and hope they would recover on their own. As he stood there, looking at the trembling cubs and the exhausted mother, a wave of determination washed over him. He had to act. There was no way he could send them back out into the cold. The moment he had opened the door, he had made a commitment to these animals, and now he would do everything in his power to ensure they survived. Thomas quickly moved to the kitchen, grabbing what he could find, blankets, towels, and some leftover warm milk he had from the morning. He wasn't sure if the cubs would drink it, but it was the best he could do for now. His mind raced through possible solutions. What could he do to help them? How could he make sure they stayed warm and safe? He returned to the living room, carefully placing the milk and blankets near the cubs. The mother bear watched him, her eyes following his every movement, but she didn't interfere. She seemed exhausted, as though every part of her was telling her to rest, but she kept a watchful eye on her cubs, making sure they were safe. Thomas could sense the fear still lingering in her, but there was also trust. She was trusting him to care for her cubs. As Thomas knelt down to check on the cubs, he was struck by just how small and fragile they were. They were no more than a few months old, but they seemed so much younger. The cold had taken its toll on them. One of the cubs was still struggling to walk properly, its tiny leg unsteady, while the other two were trembling uncontrollably. The frost-covered fur on their little bodies was a stark reminder of the harsh conditions they had endured. Thomas gently wrapped one of the blankets around the cubs, trying to soothe them. He was unsure whether he should try to feed them milk or wait for the mother to make the next move. Was she nursing them? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the cubs were vulnerable, and he had to do something to help them feel safe. He turned to the mother bear. She was still standing near the door, her large body seemingly frozen in place, but her eyes followed every movement Thomas made. There was a strange mix of gratitude and worry in her gaze. It was as if she was silently thanking him for bringing them inside, but at the same time, she was waiting for some sign from him that he could be trusted. Thomas decided to approach slowly, not wanting to alarm her. He spoke gently, his voice low and calm. "It's okay," he whispered, "you're safe now. I'm going to help them." The mother bear let out a soft grunt, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was considering his words. Then, she stepped toward him, slowly and cautiously, and sniffed at the blankets around the cubs. She nudged one of her cubs with her nose, as if ensuring that they were comfortable, and Thomas could see the weight of her responsibility as a mother in that single gesture. After a few moments, the mother bear let out a soft huff, as if satisfied with what he had done, and lay down beside her cubs. She curled her body around them, her large, protective frame forming a barrier between the cubs and the rest of the world. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. For now, they were safe. With the immediate needs of the cubs addressed, Thomas settled into the quiet rhythm of watching over them. But deep down, he knew that the journey wasn't over yet. This wasn't just about sheltering them for one night. It was about building trust with these wild animals and proving that he could be relied upon. In the days that followed, Thomas spent every moment he could tending to the bear family. He fed the cubs and tried to encourage them to drink the milk, even though they were still wary of him. The mother bear watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution, never fully relaxing, but never showing any signs of aggression either. Slowly, they began to understand that he wasn't a threat, but a source of care and comfort. Thomas had to keep his distance, giving the bear family the space they needed to feel safe, but he also kept a constant, watchful eye on them. Every time he refilled their water, every time he brought them food, the mother bear would look at him, her gaze softer, more trusting. She was still wild, still a creature of the forest, but she was beginning to accept his help, and that acceptance was the foundation of the trust he needed to move forward. He continued to monitor their health, making sure they stayed warm and safe. Slowly, the cubs regained their strength. The limping cub began to walk again, though a bit wobbly, and the other two started to play with each other. The mother bear, though still reserved, had begun to show signs of settling into this temporary safe haven. In the midst of this quiet progress, Thomas felt a bond forming with the bear family, something he had never expected, but something he could no longer ignore. In helping them, he had found a purpose beyond his solitary life. In the days that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The once wary and exhausted mother bear, who had first arrived at Thomas's door with nothing but fear and desperation in her eyes, began to change. Her posture softened, her body no longer tense with the burden of survival. She started to move more confidently, her steps less uncertain, as though she had realized that she and her cubs were truly safe. Thomas watched in awe as the bear seemed to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The wild instincts that had driven her to knock on his door had shifted to a sense of calm, perhaps from the peace of knowing her cubs were warm and fed, or maybe because of the trust they had begun to place in him. But what struck Thomas most was how the bear began to interact with him. Where once she would shy away from his touch, now she would allow him to come closer, her eyes no longer filled with mistrust. She would let him tend to the cubs without worry, and even when he moved near, she seemed more accepting, as though she was beginning to understand that he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had taken them in when the world outside had been so unforgiving. The change wasn't just physical, it was emotional. There was a sense of security, of peace, that had settled over the mother bear and her cubs. And it was a change Thomas could feel in his own heart too. Every time he saw the mother bear curl up protectively around her cubs, or when the cubs nuzzled close to her for warmth, Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. But the most profound moment came when the mother bear, after weeks of silence and distance, nudged Thomas gently with her head as he sat beside them. The gesture was subtle, but it was her way of showing gratitude, her way of saying that she trusted him. In that moment, Thomas understood the depth of the bond they had formed. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a mutual understanding that had grown over time. A bond between a man and a wild creature who had both faced the unknown and had come through it together. But just as things seemed to settle into a sense of calm, an unexpected challenge arose. One afternoon, as Thomas was sitting by the fire, tending to the bear family, a loud crashing noise from outside broke the quiet atmosphere. His heart jumped in his chest as he leapt to his feet, rushing to the window. In the distance, he could see dark figures moving toward the house, their shapes looming ominously against the horizon. At first, he couldn't tell what they were, but as they grew closer, he realized that they were other wild animals. Likely predators, drawn to the smell of the bear family. His breath caught in his throat. He knew what this meant. The mother bear would have to protect her cubs at all costs. His heart raced as he turned to the mother bear. She was standing near the door, her large frame tense, her eyes scanning the area. Her cubs huddled close to her, sensing the danger, their tiny bodies trembling. The situation had escalated quickly, and Thomas knew this was their ultimate test. The other animals, perhaps wolves or a pack of coyotes, had picked up on the scent of the bear family and were circling closer. The mother bear's instincts kicked in, and she let out a low growl, a warning to the approaching threat. Thomas stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The bear had trusted him, but now he had to trust her to protect her family. The sound of the growls and snarls grew louder. It was clear that the predators were getting closer, and in that moment, Thomas understood the gravity of what was happening. The bear was preparing for a fight, and her cubs would need her to be strong. But what if the predators were too strong, too many? Could the mother bear defend them all? And what role could Thomas play in this? He didn't have much time to think. He grabbed a nearby broom, anything to make noise and scare off the approaching danger. But as he turned to face the mother bear, she locked eyes with him, her gaze no longer fearful or uncertain. It was resolute, confident. She had made her decision. She would protect her family no matter what. Thomas stepped back, realizing that the mother bear's protective instincts were in full force now. He didn't need to fight for them, he just needed to trust her. As the wild animals approached the door, the mother bear stood tall, her body low to the ground, ready to charge if necessary. Her growls grew louder, more defiant, and Thomas could see the power behind them. This wasn't just a scared, exhausted mother anymore. This was a lioness in her own right, prepared to defend her cubs at all costs. In that tense moment, a part of Thomas understood something profound. He had watched as the mother bear transformed from a creature seeking shelter into a fierce protector, one who had earned his respect, one who had earned her place in his heart. There was no turning back now. No matter what happened, this mother bear and her cubs had found a safe haven in him, and he would protect them too with everything he had. The tension reached its peak as the predators got even closer, but just as suddenly as they had appeared, the dark shapes seemed to retreat. Whether it was the strength in the bear's growl, or the presence of Thomas that helped scare them off, the threat had subsided. As the sound of the animals faded into the distance, Thomas exhaled a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. He turned to the bear, who was still standing protectively over her cubs. They had made it. In the aftermath of the tension, Thomas realized how far they had come. The ultimate test had revealed the depth of their bond. The bear had proven her strength, and he had learned to trust her instincts. Together, they had faced the wild and survived. It wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a partnership, one that neither of them had ever expected, but one that would forever change both of their lives. Weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation with the predators, and in that time, Thomas had witnessed something extraordinary. The once timid mother bear, who had knocked on his door in desperation, had transformed into a symbol of strength and courage. Her cubs had grown, no longer the fragile little creatures they once were, but healthy, playful bears with enough energy to chase each other through the yard, and enough confidence to explore their surroundings. But as much as Thomas had grown attached to them, he knew that the time was coming for the bear family to return to the wild. Nature was their true home, and it was where they belonged. His heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. He had kept them safe, helped them heal, and given them the care they needed. Now it was time to let them go. Thomas carefully prepared for their release. He had spent countless hours researching the right place, a remote area far from human settlements, where the bears could thrive in peace. He wanted to ensure that they would be safe and free to live their lives as they should, without the looming threat of human interference. But even with his careful planning, the moment of release was not something he felt ready for. As he loaded the bear family into the transport vehicle, his hands trembled. It was a strange feeling. Part of him wanted to keep them close, to protect them forever, but he understood that true freedom meant letting go. He stood quietly by the vehicle, watching the mother bear as she nuzzled her cubs, her eyes soft but knowing. There was a sense of peace in her demeanor, as though she, too, knew that this chapter was ending. Finally, the journey to the release site began. The silence in the vehicle was almost suffocating, as if the weight of the moment was too much to bear. Thomas stole glances at the bear family in the rearview mirror, his heart heavy. The mother bear was calm, her cubs restless but safe, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder what they must be feeling. Had they grown attached to him, too? Did they feel the same sorrow in saying goodbye? As they reached the release site, the wild beauty of the forest stretched out before them. Trees towering, streams running clear, and the soft scent of earth filling the air. The perfect place for the bears to start their new life. Thomas stopped the vehicle and slowly opened the door. For a moment, everything was still. The mother bear cautiously stepped out, her cubs following close behind. They sniffed the air, taking in the smells of the forest. Their bodies relaxed as if they had known this was their true home all along. Thomas stepped back, watching the bear family in awe. It was a bittersweet moment, one that brought tears to his eyes. As the cubs ventured a little further into the wild, the mother bear paused for a moment. She turned to face Thomas, her gaze meeting his in a quiet, meaningful exchange. There was no need for words, her eyes said it all. She had come to him when she needed help, and he had given it. Now, she was returning to the world she had always belonged to, but she had not forgotten the man who had shown her kindness. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears as he realized that this was it. This was the final moment. The bear family had healed, had grown, and now it was time for them to live freely once again. Just before she disappeared into the forest with her cubs, the mother bear took one last look at Thomas. She raised her head in a slow, deliberate motion, as if to acknowledge him one final time. Then, with a quiet grunt, she led her cubs into the woods, disappearing from his sight. Thomas stood there, his heart heavy but full of pride. The tears he had been holding back finally fell freely, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of knowing that he had played a part in their journey. He had given them a second chance, and now it was their time to thrive in the wild once more. As he made his way back to the vehicle, Thomas couldn't help but smile through his tears. He knew that the bear family would never forget him, just as he would never forget them. They had shared a bond that was stronger than any words could express. A bond forged through survival, love, and trust. It was a bond that would last a lifetime. The forest was quiet now, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Thomas took a deep breath and walked away, knowing that he had done something extraordinary. He had helped a family in need, and in doing so, he had found a new sense of purpose. A reminder that even in the most unexpected places, the bond between humans and animals can change lives forever. As he drove away, the image of the mother bear and her cubs stayed with him, always in his heart, a memory of a chapter in his life that would never truly end. The wild had called them home, but their story would live on in his soul. As the story of the bear family comes to an end, we are reminded of the incredible bond between humans and animals. It's a bond built on trust, compassion, and the willingness to help those in need, no matter how small or large. Thomas's selfless act not only saved a family of bears, but also touched the hearts of many who witnessed their incredible journey. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of kindness, we invite you to take action. Support animal rescues in your community, whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading awareness about the struggles wildlife face. Every small gesture counts, and if you believe in the beauty of second chances, share this story with others. Let's continue spreading hope and compassion, one story at a time. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming rescue stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think about this journey and what animal rescue means to you. Together, we can make the world a kinder place, one rescued animal at a time. Thanks for watching.